March 1945. The west bank of the Rhine, a few miles south of Düsseldorf. A German observer is looking across the river, and he's seeing exactly what he's been told to look for. Sherman tanks parked under trees. Artillery in the orchards. Trucks arriving all night, engines running, men shouting at each other. The radio people are hearing it too. 2 American divisions are talking to each other about the river crossing. Engineers are bringing up pontoons. Somebody's arguing about fuel. So the German command does the sensible thing. It moves men and guns south to sit opposite those 2 divisions and wait. 30,000 men. That's what 2 divisions are. There were 1,100 of them. Most of them were art students. The tanks were rubber. You could pick one up with 3 friends. For 50 years they weren't allowed to tell anyone. When the files finally opened, one of them said the hardest part of the war was going home and being asked what he did and having to say, "I painted trucks." He'd painted trucks. He'd also helped move a German corps to the wrong place before the biggest river crossing of the war. The Americans learned deception the way you learn most things in a war. By being on the receiving end. In North Africa, the British had been fooling the Germans for 2 years with dummy tanks, fake supply dumps, whole fake railheads. It worked, and the Americans noticed. The man who pushed for an American version was Ralph Ingersoll, who before the war had run a newspaper in New York, and before that had helped launch a magazine you've heard of. He was, by his own account, an insufferable person. He was also right about this. His argument was simple. The Germans don't see the American army. They see a picture of it, built from photos, radio intercepts, and rumors. If you control the picture, you control what they do about it. In January 1944, the army stood up a unit to do exactly that. On paper, it was called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, which is the kind of name you give something when you don't want questions. It was really 4 units stuck together. A camouflage battalion. A sonic company. A radio company. And a small combat engineer company, there mostly to guard the other 3 and dig them in. The camouflage battalion is the one everyone remembers because of who was in it. The army had gone looking for men who could make things look like other things, and the obvious place to look was art school. So the 603rd had a 21-year-old from Indiana who kept a stack of Vogue in his footlocker and sketched dresses in the margins of his field manual. Bill Blass. It had a quiet kid from Pittsburgh who'd go on to be one of the most important abstract painters in America. Ellsworth Kelly. It had Art Kane, who'd later take the most famous photograph of jazz musicians ever made. Plus set designers, illustrators, a bird painter, and a lot of people from advertising. 400 artists, handed a tank that weighed 93 pounds and came folded in a bag. The first way was the obvious one, rubber. Inflatable tanks, trucks, jeeps, artillery pieces, even aircraft. Blown up with a compressor in about 20 minutes, held down with stakes, and from 400 yards, or from a plane, good enough. The trick wasn't the tank. It was everything around it. Real tanks leave tracks, so they drove a bulldozer around in circles. Real tanks have crews, so a few men would sit on them, smoke and hang laundry off the gun. And then, and this is the part the artists loved, they camouflaged them badly. On purpose. A perfectly hidden tank tells the enemy nothing. A tank someone tried to hide and didn't quite manage tells him everything. The second way was sound. In 1943, the Army sent engineers to Fort Knox with the best recording equipment in the country, some of it borrowed from Bell Labs, and recorded tanks. Not just tanks driving. Tanks idling. Tanks turning on gravel. Men building a pontoon bridge, complete with the swearing. All of it went onto wire recorders, which were the new thing. Then they mounted 500-pound speakers on half tracks and mixed the recordings live, like a DJ, into whatever the plan needed. An armored battalion arriving at midnight. A bridge going up at 3. You could hear it 15 miles away. Germans who surrendered later described the units they'd heard in detail. The third way was radio, and it's the cleverest. Every Morse operator has what they called a fist, a rhythm. The Germans kept files on American operators the way you'd recognize a friend's typing. So the 23rd's radio men would sit with a real division for days, learning how its operators sounded, and then when the real division moved off in secret, they'd stay and keep sending. Same fists. Same sloppy procedure. Same complaints about the coffee. The fourth way didn't have a name in the manual. They called it atmosphere. Every town in France had someone talking to the Germans. So the 23rd made sure the town saw the right thing. They sewed the patches of whichever division they were pretending to be. They painted its markings on their trucks and drove the same 6 trucks through the square all afternoon. They posted fake military police at the crossroads. And a couple of officers would put on a general's stars, walk into the best cafe, order loudly, and let the waiter overhear which division was in town. Bill Blass said later it was the best theater he ever did. He wasn't entirely joking. They landed in Normandy about a week after the day and got their first job almost immediately. It did not go well. The 2nd Armored Division was pulling out of a forest near the front to go somewhere else, quietly. The 23rd's job was to stay in the forest and be the 2nd Armored for a few days. They'd had almost no notice, half the men hadn't arrived, and they set the dummy tanks up in daylight, near a road, where the French farmers walking past could see men carrying tanks. A real officer who came to inspect them was not polite about it. Nobody knows if the Germans were fooled. Probably not. But that operation is the reason the rest of them worked, because it taught them the thing that would keep them alive. The rubber is maybe 10%. The rest is behaving like a division. The traffic, the noise, the radio chatter, the guy in the cafe. If any one of those is missing, the Germans notice the gap, and a gap is worse than nothing. August 1944. The Germans have been pushed into the port of Brest, on the tip of Brittany, and told to hold it to the last man, which they take seriously. 3 American divisions are closing in. The 23rd is sent to pretend to be a 4th, an armored division, sitting on the flank to make the Germans think a tank assault is coming from a direction it isn't. This time they do it properly. Tanks in the hedgerows, badly hidden. Tank noise all night. Radio traffic. Patches. The German garrison hears an armored division arrive. And then somebody on the American side, who didn't know what the 23rd was, parked a real artillery battery next to them and started firing. The Germans did what anyone does when they're shelled. They looked for the guns and fired back at the rubber tanks, which the 23rd were standing next to. Men were hit. The unit's own record is blunt about it. The flank was real, the shells were real, the tanks were not, and the men were somewhere in between. Over the whole war, the 23rd would lose 3 men killed and around 30 wounded, which is small until you remember they had nothing to shoot back with except a company of engineers, and at Brest, a bulldozer. Brest fell in September. The German commander said afterwards that he'd expected an armored attack from the north. There was never anything in the north but rubber. Then, in the middle of September, Patton's Third Army ran out of petrol. The advance across France had gone faster than the supplies, and while the army waited for fuel, it had to move a real armored division north. That left a stretch of the front about 70 miles long along the Moselle and up into Luxembourg, with almost nobody in it. The plan was for the 23rd to be the 6th Armored for 2 days, until somebody real could arrive. So they became it. Tanks under the trees. The Sonic cars running every night. Radio operators using the 6th Armored's fists. The same trucks with the same markings looping through the same villages. Officers in the wrong rank walking into the wrong cafes. 2 days became 3. Then 5. Then 8. The replacement was late, and the fuel was late, and the 1100 men just kept doing the show. Across the river were German units that, if they had walked forward, would have found an open road toward the Allied rear with a bulldozer and some very worried art students in the way. They didn't walk forward. The German maps for that week showed the 6th Armored exactly where the 23rd had drawn it. Kelly said afterwards that the unit's real skill wasn't making tanks. It was patience. Standing in a wet field for a week, pretending to be a thing, and not once breaking character. By March 1945, the Americans were on the Rhine, and the Rhine was the last thing between them and the middle of Germany. The 9th Army was going to cross near Rheinberg. The 23rd was told to build 2 divisions 10 miles south of that, opposite Viersen, and make the Germans believe that's where it was happening. This wasn't a flank or a gap. It was 2 full divisions, and it needed every trick at once, on a scale they'd never tried. Over about a week they put out more than 600 inflatables. Tanks, guns, trucks, and a fake airstrip with rubber aircraft parked on it. They dug real gun pits for fake guns. They built real supply dumps with empty crates. Every night the Sonic cars played a division moving up to the water. Bridging trucks. Boats being unloaded. The radio company ran the traffic of 2 divisions, complete with the arguments. And while the 23rd made all that noise, the real 30th and 79th moved north in silence, at night, with their radios off and their patches covered. The German army's own maps from that week, captured afterwards, show what they believed. 2 American divisions at Viersen. German units shifted to sit opposite them. On the 24th of March, the 9th Army went across at Rheinberg. Its casualties for the crossing were so low that people reading the report assumed a typo. The commander of the 9th Army wrote a letter afterwards thanking a unit that, officially, wasn't there and hadn't done anything. Viersen was the last big one. Between Normandy and the Rhine they'd done 21 of these, most of them small, none of them ever admitted. When the war ended, the 23rd went home like everyone else, and then it stopped existing, which for once was literally true. The whole thing was classified. The unit history, the after-action reports, the photographs, the fact that there had been a unit at all. The men were told not to talk about it, and this being 1945, they didn't. Blas became Bill Blas. Kelly became Ellsworth Kelly. Kane took the photograph. The bird painter painted birds. Their families knew they'd been in the war and in Europe, and that was roughly it. One of them said the worst part of the reunions for the rest of his life was the question everyone asks. What did you do over there? And the only honest answer he was allowed was, I painted trucks. The file stayed closed for 51 years. In 1996 they opened. And people started calling the veterans, most of whom were in their 70s, and asking whether it was true. It took another 28 years for Congress to get round to it. In 2022, the president signed a bill giving the unit the Congressional Gold Medal. In March 2024, they handed it over. Of the 1,100, 7 were still alive. 3 of them could make it to Washington. The oldest was 100. Asked what he wanted people to know, one of them said, more or less. It was a good trick, and it worked, and most of us were just kids who could draw. Which is true, and also not the whole thing. Because the tanks were fake. The men in the foxholes next to them were not.